Good afternoon. I hope people are not too sleepy. Had a good meal and very jet lagged, so this should be an easy Q&A at the end. That's good. So we're going to talk about development best practices today. I know traditionally this session has usually been done by Peter Willitsen. Fortunately, I am not Peter Willitsen, so you may leave now. But we'll try to do our best. I know Peter always talks about getting on a soapbox in this session. I'll try to avoid it, but I probably won't. There's a couple of things that we've been hammering for years. I know with 365, a lot of those are actually now more enforced. So we'll go through those. I'm joined today by Eric. He's one of my colleagues on the solution architecture team. So we've been very involved the past, well, not just a year, but the past year and a half to 2 years with a lot of the TAP customers, new customers going live. So ultimately, a lot of our tooling is new for 365, so we are effectively still also ourselves learning best practices as we go. So we work a lot with the partners and the customers that are working on implementations today. We're getting a lot of feedback from our own team, but these things will evolve, and I'd love to hear your feedback. So let's get going. So there are some old ones that you've heard before, but there's definitely a couple of new ones that I wanted to highlight. We've divvied this up into sort of 3 sections. One a little bit more about process, then one specifically about customizations, and then I wanted to just talk about extensions as well, obviously. So on the process side, source control is something that we've always advocated for AX. It has been somewhat cumbersome in previous releases, but by virtue of being in Visual Studio now, we get a lot of those source control features for free, essentially, right? So today, source control is kind of optional, but not really. By that, I mean that LCS will actually go to your source control to do code upgrades and things like that. Every developer will have their own development machine, so to keep things in sync between multiple developers, source control is ultimately the way to go. So at this point, I would argue that you really don't have much of a choice anymore but to use source control. And the licensing scheme on Visual Studio Team Services has drastically changed as well. So for most projects, you can get a lot done without having to pay any extra for the services. So that's the good news. You want to touch on the project files, Eric?
Sure. Yeah. So the project files in Visual Studio can be added to VSTS, but it sort of depends on how you use them. Typically, they're used to reduce what needs to be compiled, and in that case, they don't really need to be checked in. But it's kind of personal preference. And one thing that there's some reuse capability is to have a project that contains all the resources for a specific part of the product, such as ledger posting or journal posting or ledger journal trans stuff or whatever, and then you can reuse that amongst your team to get to those things quickly.
Yeah, I think with 2012, everybody used projects, or at least we've always said that was kind of the best practice to put your customizations and group them in projects. You can still do that same thing as well, but I think from our experience, we have seen very few people do it, very few benefits. Most developers kind of create a project that they use as a working space and just never check it in the source control. There are benefits, however, to adding the project file to source control, and that the integration and the way Visual Studio works is that anything you add to the project will be automatically added, or those types of integration points. What I've been doing, and I don't know what your experience is, I typically have like one giant project that I just personally use, and it stays as a pending add to source control, and it never actually goes in, just to get all the benefits. But there's, to my experience, not a whole lot of benefit because it's not used for the build or any of that, or deployment or anything like that. So, all right. So that brings us to the builds, right? So as Eric pointed out, as you're developing in Visual Studio, there's 2 ways to do a compile, to do a build. Try not to. Can you guys see that from the angle there? Okay. There's two ways to do the build. One would be just a full build, but since the experience is entirely in Visual Studio, whatever you have in your project, you can just compile that, and it's sort of an incremental compile. For those of you who have a lot of experience with 2012, you know that even there, the incremental CIL is not always 100% reliable based on what the changes are that you've made. You'll find the same true in AX7. We are working, it's all .NET based, right? So we are working with net modules and trying to split things up correctly. But every now and then you'll find definitely the need to do a full build from the menu. So keep those things in mind. You may see some weird errors that happens. Full build usually solves those kinds of things. Do you want to pick up?
Oh. Yeah, and remember that in Visual Studio, saving it does not compile it. So don't save it and check it in without the compile first, or else go to the ALM session.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen that quite a bit, right? People coming from 2012 or 2009, you have to make a quick change, you know exactly what you're doing. It's like, just make the change, save it, check it in. Be aware of a couple of things, right? First of all, on the compilation side, I mean, you do want to test it. One other thing I think is kind of dug in here as well. So reference properties. One of the things that we had when the AOT was inside of the client is, let's say you renamed a field, right? And you had sort of this automagic thing where other references to the field would also be changed. That was actually already an issue if you used source control in AX 2012 and before, because those objects would actually be updated automatically. But unless you check them out and check them back in, you were probably missing some issues. And if you were doing some sort of automated build with 12, a lot of people ran into issues there. In AX7, since everything is file-based, so each object is its own file, and we're really using Visual Studio as much as we can, changing a field name means you would have to actually go to the controls and fix the properties there as well, right? There's no more automagic, everything gets fixed. So that's another good reason to make sure once you make these types of changes, you actually do a full compile so that before you check it in the source control, you're aware that all the references are properly fixed. We do have tooling around finding references and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's not like you're gonna have to start digging for where did I use this, but yeah.
Yeah, the references work well, that's kind of like a common or a typical where the incremental build might not catch everything. That's a good sort of a pattern kind of a thing, and why the full build. But we always do full builds before we check in.
And then the other thing is the synchronize, right? So same thing in 2012 where you made some database changes, you hit save, and like magic happens, right? In AX7, the synchronize is a bit more explicit. You can do a synchronize as you're building the whole package. But you actually do also have the option when you have a project with just a couple of tables in, you can right-click on the project, say synchronize, and only synchronize what it is that you have in the project. So that's a quick tip that you don't have to wait for, 10 minutes or whatever for all the security artifacts and the tables and fields being synchronized. So there's some, it's a free tip for you.
Yeah, there's a synchronize every time you build a project, but that is kind of wasteful of time. And I think in the options under the Dynamics 365 menu, there's a synchronize it the first time you build it option.
Yeah, I think, if you go to the full build dialog, there's an extra tab where you can turn off best practices, you can turn off cross-reference, don't do that. And there's a synchronize flag as well. So you can kind of make sure these things happen when you do full. So that kind of brings us to the build, and actually there's a point that we didn't touch on that goes into that. So we want people to use the build VMs, right? When customers buy a license, a build VM is one of the VMs that you get with the license. Please, please use it, right? If you have multiple developers and you use source control, you want to make sure that whatever you end up deploying to your environments is what you have in source control, right? You can create the deployable package, which is the artifact that you actually deploy to the environments. You can create those from Visual Studio itself. But thinking back to 2012, it would be the same as a developer taking their model store and copying that to production, right? Nobody does that way. So I encourage you to not do that with the deployable packages as well. The build VMs are there to do that, and they're automated. So we didn't have any of this in AX 2012. We do have it in AX7. It's a fully automated process. We have sessions on that tomorrow in continuous delivery. We'll talk about the builds as well. So I encourage you, use that build VM that you get. There are options for ISVs that have lots of different versions or different products that they have to manage. There are ways that you could potentially create a build VM on premises using those VHD options. So for a larger project where that may be an issue, keep in mind then there you may run into some VSTS licensing as far as, if you need a lot of builds and that kind of stuff. But for any normal project, just use the build VM you get. The features are fully automated. You can run it nightly. Use those features, right? All right. You want to talk about this one? This is also from experience.
Yeah, so the UAT environment, or the sandbox environment, which is the multi-box, no X++ on it, no dev tools, so you could complain about not having X++, but there's no tools, so you can't use it anyway. And you have to really remember that you have full RDP access. It's considered a development environment, the UAT box. You can get in there, do query plans, that kind of stuff. But don't copy assemblies, don't do stuff like that, because that's not allowed in production. And so and really the only thing that's allowed is deployable package.
Correct.
So, and that's how you get assemblies and things to the UAT and production.
Right.
Ultimately, you want to do those meaningful things exactly the same on UAT and production.
Yeah, so the point is also that in 2012 and before, the development environment was essentially also a runtime environment, right? You developed straight inside of an AOS. In AX7, that is absolutely not the case. You're working in Visual Studio, and not until you compile and hit run is when you actually spin up the AOS and code gets put on there for debugging purposes. That also means deployment to go to a production environment. There's no code involved. It's really just the binaries that the build VM or Visual Studio produced. Those are the ones that get deployed. So that means a production instance has no source code, right? There's no moving of XPOs or XMLs or that kind of stuff. It just doesn't work, right? It's only binaries. That means these production environments also won't have dev tools on it, but you actually don't get access to production. You only get access to your test environments. And we've seen people that during their implementation, they go onto their test environments and they, set some flags in the registry or whatever it is they need, maybe to do integrations and things like that. But then when it's time to go to production, they realize that they actually don't have access to the virtual machines that run AX. And whatever they did to make their tests work, they can't do in production. So being mindful, that's why I'm saying it is a sandbox, but don't make it a sandbox, right? So it's a sandbox in the sense that you want to use it for testing, but ideally you would never actually go on those VMs and do anything. Please keep that in mind.
Yeah, if you submit a service request for something like that on production, it'll be rejected.
Correct.
There's a pretty limited number of things that fall into other that are allowed.
Yeah, exactly. So Agile versus Waterfall. You heard it this morning as well in Mike's keynote. He's talking about the way that we're encouraging implementations to be done slightly differently, more phased approach, but more quicker. That also means as an IT staff, as developers, we're going to have to adapt as well to the realities, right? We'll talk about extensions later, which plays into this a little bit. But I definitely encourage you to look at how these implementations are done, right? I know from experience, I come from the partner channel, you go through a sales cycle, you identify the gaps, up front a bunch of things that you're going to have to develop because there are clear gaps. Usually estimate those, they become part of the budget. That's great. It's essentially kind of a waterfall model. I'm not saying do away with that. But typically, as you go through the implementation, things shake out during testing. We have a gap here, we have a gap there. First of all, and we'll get to that as well, I would encourage people to try and push back more. I know we've all been in that situation where a customer comes along and says, this is what I need. And as a developer, no, that's not what you need. But, you're there, you're in the situation, you kind of understand their pain, you're trying to help. But the way we're doing away with overlayering, which we'll get to, moving to extensions, some of these things I'd encourage you to push back on and see how far you get. If you move on to sort of a sprint model, and that's how we develop internally as well at Microsoft, we set 2-week sprints and we decide, we get all these requirements from customers and partners and from the solution architects like us. Here's all the stuff that we want to add to AX, right? We obviously can't do everything. So we get an estimate of, okay, this may take a couple of days, whatever, and we decide this is what we think we can do in 2 weeks. And these are the most important things that we have to do. Stick with those, do them in 2 weeks, put it in a test environment, and decide what you're going to do next, right? Agile does not, that was always my thing. I developed a team of technical consultants in the partner channel, and that was always what we were afraid of on moving to Agile, that we said it seems like an open model, right? It's like the customer could just keep asking for more and more and more. Where does this end, right? But that's not really what the Agile versus waterfall discussion is really about. It's about just making sure that your because that's typically what happens, right? You get more requirements, but the deadline never moves, right? So by the end, you're 1 week away from go live, you still have 2 pieces of development to finish. They're probably going to get tested the last day if you're lucky. I mean, those types of things ultimately nobody wants, but that's the reality of things. And that's why I encourage people to try and push back further. And if you move into these sprints, I think customers will be seeing also, how much they're asking for and how it fits or doesn't fit into the timeline. And I think if we're encouraging implementations to move more to that Agile model in general, like go live on finance and then add this and try to do it quick, but keep adding things. Don't wait for these humongous projects of 18 months to finish. I think we can fit our development processes to fit that model as well. So I encourage you to think about that. So moving on to actual customizations, right? This was all about kind of process and ideologies in a way. So overlayering versus extension. We had a session yesterday. We have a repeat actually right after this session about moving from overlayering to extension. I want to make this very clear because it seems like some people did not fully understand. But overlayering is something that we are ultimately going to stop from happening on the standard application, right? We are requiring people to move to extensions. It's not just for ISVs on AppSource. It's not just for Microsoft. It's everybody, right? If you want to learn more about that and have that discussion as to what that means and why, I encourage you to stick around for the next session. But I want to make that clear. The benefits of going to the extension model is really all about the LM cycle, how we can give customers hot fixes more easily, the whole installing a hot fix now, recompiling those things. We're doing away with that to be able to be a bit more quicker and be able to react faster. From a development point of view, there's clear benefits as well. If you can segregate all your code into your own package, which is essentially, in the back end, its own DLL, obviously you don't compile the whole application every time, right? People coming from 2012, I've heard horror stories of an AX 2012 compile, taking 8 or 9 hours. We did a lot of work to try and minimize that, and some people got it down to like 30 minutes, and some were still a few hours. Now we're down, the compiler's being rewritten. Even a full application compile takes, 15 minutes? 15 minutes or so, so that's all great. But if you actually separate your code into its own package, into its own DLL, your compile is a matter of minutes or seconds even if you just have a few artifacts. So keep those things in mind, right? There's clear benefits of separating the code out. And we'll talk about some of those benefits.
Yeah, and you'll see the benefits when you're working on things, if you're doing, your model is very small, and of that 15 minutes, right, half of it is AppSuite. So those other 15, are quite fast and
right.
And it's a good feeling.
Yeah, and we talked about the incremental compile versus the full build. If you happen to have to do a full build because you have some issues, you're talking minutes and not 15 minutes if you separated the code. So keep those things in mind. Yes, sir.
Will you remove layering altogether?
So the question is, will we remove layering altogether? That's not something we've actually talked about at all. One of the things that, and I'm not getting on a segue, so stop me here if I'm taking too much time, but the way the layering system works is slightly different in 7 already, in a good way. Models are in effect already layers in themselves, if you will, Now in 7, they're kind of sublayers. So models overlayer each other, and that's mainly done to avoid some of those model conflicts you saw in previous releases. So there are some of those constructs that are important, and actually extensions as well. Extensions can technically conflict as well, but because of our layering system, they do have a hierarchy in how they're applied, and that gets into questions I've gotten before around how to define those hierarchies, and I'd rather not get into that here, but I don't see us actually removing layering altogether. And actually, there could still be benefits for customers or ISVs, right? If an ISV says, I have the solution, I'll give you the source code, and you can actually still overlay their solution potentially. So I think there's still good reasons in some cases to use it. For our purposes, we will just essentially avoid or not allow you to do these things. And the tooling will pick up on that. You see that today with the platform already. If you try to overlayer the platform because you have the code, it will just tell you that you can't, right? So that's essentially what we'll be doing there.
Much less common to have conflicts when you do not have overlayering.
Exactly, yeah.
So.
All right, so that brings us to the point of intrusive customizations, right? It's something we've talked about in the other session. Again, we'll have a repeat of that right after this. And I literally copy-pasted this slide because I just wanted to point that out. But intrusive customizations is something that I'm sure everybody in this room has done at some point, if not quite regularly. We're trying to define what that means in intrusive customization. We're trying to define it for you as the channel of partners and customers. But we're also trying to define that for our internal purposes to kind of know what is our end goal, what do we need to enable, right? And intrusive customization, and this is kind of like a high-level definition that we're trying to keep in our heads. But essentially what we're trying to say is it must not change type definitions, meaning we do not want you to add an argument to an existing method, right? Those types of things, changing those definitions. I don't know what other examples we had that I can't think of right now. I think the encapsulation principle, so changing private methods to being public, those types of things, just don't do that, right? And obviously when we move to overlayering, you won't be able to, but those are the types of things you can really start thinking about now that you will really want to avoid doing. I think we have in our extensibility story enough features to be able to do most of those things anyway. I think the augmentation classes will allow you to, well, not add arguments to a method, but at least be able to keep state.
Yeah, I think that anything that's intrusive ultimately is something that changes something, right? Something that was already there. That's kind of what makes it intrusive.
Oh, a lot of hands going up. This is good. I'll start here. Yeah.
If you want to make a field larger because you've got larger part numbers, et cetera, that is a data type, not a.
Yeah. So the question is, how about things like changing, a string size on an EDT or something like that, right? Those things are you're actually able to do those with extensions. So there are certain properties that we are allowing you to change with extensions because we know they're important. And you're right, technically that would be sort of changing a type definition. We are actually adding a few features around that, I don't know in which version upcoming, because we've realized sometimes if multiple ISVs try to change the string size, what do you do? How do you resolve it? So we're working on some of those, I wouldn't call them conflict resolutions, but at least trying to make sure that things don't go sideways if you happen to get into those situations. Yes? Table property that can only be
like the
overlaid.
label of the table, the stuff.
Yeah, so that's something that we're taking, and again, I encourage you to, if you've not been to the other session, to stick around here. So from the extensibility story, we are, as we see things, as we see needs of certain properties to be able to be changed anyway, we are allowing you to do those through extensions. Things like, changing labels, very common, you can do that. Things like, string size is one.
What's your example? Do you have one, or
Just changing a property on a table.
at the
Changing
table?
so
At the table level, or
yeah. So we're trying to avoid just opening everything up, right? Exposing all the properties. We're trying to see which properties do people really need to be able to change that we're taking away with overlayering. Do we feel like they have an impact? And that goes back to our intrusive customization definition, where we say, would this be intrusive, yes or no? And intrusive is more of that means if we update our application, and we're talking just hot fixes, is there a potential for what we allowed you to do to conflict with the update we're giving you? Changing a label, obviously, nobody's gonna bother about that. We're adding more properties like that
No,
as
but
we
somebody
go.
could lose, right? If two people change the label,
Yeah,
who's
if
going
two
to
people
win,
change,
right?
that's
still that
different story.
angle, right?
So so as far as table properties, there are some you can, some you can't. We're working with a lot of ISVs because they're sort of the code base of what a lot of you use to do implementations to kind of see what they need. And we're just exposing more properties as we feel like there's a need and we feel like it's not intrusive. That makes sense. So for example, form controls, you can enable them, disable them, hide them, show them, like the visible properties. Some of those properties we're just allowing you to extend them, right? Privileges. That's a good question. I don't think privileges you can't do much with. I think it's on a role level that you'd have to fix them. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, okay. So the question is, how about, we're talking about intrusive, but some of our code that we have in the standard application is essentially not that easy to extend just by virtue of the way it's built and those things. So again, we're tackling those, and I encourage you to stay here for the next session because that's exactly what we'll talk about is what are we doing as Microsoft to make sure you can do these extensions. So let's move on, and then in the end, if there's more questions on extensions, we can take it. So to kind of tackle some of those things, and I think this is a principle that a lot of people try to live by already, hopefully, but going for automation over customization or composing over customization. The example I always give is people trying to add or generate certain ledger transactions when an invoice gets posted. It's perfectly possible, but it's an extremely intrusive customization. You're going to have to overlay a ton of posting classes and whatnot. The point is, you can already post a ledger journal to do ledger transactions. So the question is, can I compose both? Is there a way that I could create a snippet of code that automatically creates a ledger journal and trigger that when an invoice is posted? It's a pretty clean customization in the sense that I have one hook point. I'm reusing kind of an API, right? I generate a journal. If we as Microsoft ever change the way that ledger transactions are posted, you're covered because you're going through a journal. So think about those things, right? Can I automate or can I compose two existing things as opposed to adding lines of code all over the place? It's something that works today in 2012 as well. You can really go back and think about how you're doing some of these things. And then obviously, pushback. We already talked about that. I think, I've been guilty of that myself, working with customers that sometimes it's just too easy to say, yes, I'll do that. I think not enough times we go back and say, can you tell me exactly what it is you're trying to achieve? Because we actually may be able to do this a lot better than what you're proposing without creating these intrusive customizations, right? Just think about these things, and I think you'll find once you get into the whole overlaying extension story, I think you'll start to see how those things would be able to benefit you. So, extension learnings. You want to kick it off?
Yeah, so I think the default name for an extension is the AOT name .extension, and you'll want to add your prefix or your naming, something specific to your naming onto that for everything.
Yeah, I think we've all done that in 12, or most people have, right? You create a new class, a new field on an existing table. People use prefixes or suffixes to sort of identify this as a customization or an ISV product. With extensions, right, it's the same type of deal. So when you create an extension on a table, it'll create a new object, which, as Eric said, is typically whatever the name of the original .extension. You can actually change that file name. Don't leave it as .extension. For the exact same reason you do it in overlaying today, you want to avoid name clashes with future updates, ISVs, third parties.
And sys, actually, because there are
Correct,
quite
yes.
a few of them in sys that, we've all had to learn this along the way, and there's a bunch of them in sys that are named .extension.
Right. As our application is being split into multiple packages as well, you see some of the app teams extending each other, and they use the default extension. So you could run into future name clashes. So think about the naming, how you've done that in the past, and try to think of extensions, how you do those today. So another example here was the drag and drop, for example, right? If you drag and drop a menu item onto a menu, by default, it creates a new entry with just the name of the menu item. Just keep those things in mind, rename that new entry, because somebody else might do the same. Your future upgrade might break because, those are the types of things that are all new to all of us, and we're learning this the hard way, doing some upgrades already now from RTW to the fall release and soon the spring release, where we see these name clashes. They're easy enough to fix, right? But there's just new types of best practices that we are also learning as we go.
And they'll work forever. You just need that one time, though. You need
Correct, right. So same goes for form controls. You drag and drop a data source field. It creates a control with the data source _ field. Rename those things. Get in that practice. Another thing we see a lot done is rearranging form controls. It's typical requests from end users where they say there's too much on this grid. You want to hide stuff and move stuff and all those things. One of the extensions that we haven't enabled, and I doubt that we will, is to be able to rearrange the ordering of the existing controls. There's some technical details as to why that apparently is not that easy to do. But you can when you add new controls via extension, so you can add your own with an extension, and you can put them in between the other ones. So there are some workarounds we've seen people do. If there's only a few you want to rearrange, you could technically, with the property extension, you could hide the existing control and add your own in a different place. That's an option. Use personalizations, right? That's another thing. Personalizations in AX7 still exist. I mean, they work differently, but the experience is roughly the same. We are planning in future releases to expand the management capabilities, because that's something I think has been an issue in previous releases as well, that users can do personalizations, but it's not easy to distribute. So those are scenarios we're thinking about, especially moving to extensions. We know people will want to use this more to avoid the overlayering scenarios. So think about those things, right? What other technologies can I leverage? Personalizations, extensions, those types of things. And then what I call the domino effect. So the thing with the packages is, if you split your code into its separate package, meaning a separate DLL, the DLLs reference each other like DLLs always do in .NET. So it's a one-way reference, right? So your extension will reference the application suite, for example, which means your code can use the customer table and the sales orders and all that kind of stuff. But the standard application doesn't know about all your new stuff, and it doesn't have to because your code's separated anyway. The problem becomes if there's certain things that you have trouble getting into extensions. For example, I have a piece of code that I have to insert someplace, and it has to use my new field, but my new field is in the separate package that AppSuite doesn't know about. I run into these issues where I can't use the code, right? And that's what I call a domino effect. I've seen people say, oh, I have to pull the field back into my overlayering, and before you know it, it's this domino effect of pieces of code and artifacts that all are being pulled back into overlayering. What we're telling people at this point, and again, encourage you to go to the next session on extensions, but we are working hard to make the standard application more extensible. If you have issues today, try to put in a delegate, right? Put in a delegate, handle the event in your own package, and you avoid the issue of this domino effect of things being pulled back into overlayering. So you can prepare. At the point we have an extension point that you can use, you can probably with minimal effort use that instead, right? Isolate your code as much as you can.
Oh, there was a question back there. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the personalization.
Yes.
Is it possible to have like admin and or personalization, right? Instead of just like
Yeah, so the question is, with personalizations, it would be great to have a feature for sort of more of an admin capability where you can force a certain set of personalizations onto a set of users. Those are things that I'm not promising here, but those are things we are looking at, knowing that we'll probably want to leverage those in lieu of overlayering. So keep an eye out on the roadmap side, because those things are definitely being looked at. Unit testing. You want to talk about unit testing? Although that last bullet is mine, but go ahead.
Yeah, so, I mean, at the end of the day, the unit or the extension code, whether it be event handlers and things like that, they end up being quite small, much smaller, and you're much more in control of them.
Right.
And
Very
they're
isolated.
doing specific things, right? If you need two things, you generally have two methods to do each one of them, so that independence lends itself very well to unit testing and to all the good coding.
Right. Yeah, because essentially you're isolating your code, right,
Right.
into a handler. You're not touching this ginormous method. Now, if you want to test that method, you have to deal with all the standard code, which you don't have tests for, and you have data issues and whatnot. Isolating your code into handlers and separate classes makes it so much more easier to test without this dependence of the standard code. So think about those things.
Right.
And yeah, go ahead.
You've all added some code to the middle of something in Ledger Journal Post that's 600 lines long, right? It's intimidating, and it's risky.
Right, and it's not impossible, but very hard to test.
Right.
Right. So what I've found working with customers now, going into this whole model of creating handlers and augmentation classes, is the isolation of the code really makes it easy to write the unit test. And as I put here, I've been finding it kind of addictive. Once you start writing these unit tests, you really kind of get into it. And I'm saying you're gamified because if you look at the build process, right, we have the build VM that you get. There's an automated build. There's, these little stats that show up that say so many tests passed, so many failed. You get the green and the red. It's very addictive, very addictive.
Yeah, and
We need badges. Who votes for badges? Okay, well.
Yeah.
It's just me, I guess.
It's everybody, because we're maybe not quite as excited, but
Yeah.
But what you'll find when if you decide to try to test that 600-line method, right, you're testing things that are already there, and that makes it fragile and all that, and you're supposed to be testing what you're doing.
So if you want to see the red and the green and all that, we have an automated testing session tomorrow.
Yours does.
I do.
Ironically.
You're welcome to show up. Yes, yes sir.
And when it comes to the unit test framework, I could set up like a big company data testing against that. Do I have that still in AX7, or do I just send my method like mock data?
Great question. So the question was, in 2012, they used a separate data set for testing. There were some features around that. All those features still exist, and then some. We've added some features around data isolation, rollback features, those types of things. So tomorrow, again, session on automated testing, we'll talk exactly about that. Okay. I'm sorry? A lot of upselling, yeah, that's true. That's true. Upselling of sessions.
Shameless
But that's what
plugs.
you're here for. That's what you're here for. All right, so the other piece is leverage new and existing technologies, right?
Right. There's lots of things out there, and Joris mentioned earlier, that we need to get better at providing an API to create that journal you need. But there are lots of things to do things that need to be done.
Right.
Like GER for exporting.
Yeah, we see
all
this.
that
I mean,
stuff.
this is a typical example, right? GER. We still see. We always had a bank payments sort of framework in AX that's been replaced in AX7 with general electronic reporting. We still see today in AX7 developers and ISVs creating pieces of code that generate files. The reason I know that is because then they come to us and say, so it's in the cloud, how do I get this file downloaded? There's actually paradigms, there's actually features, and it's on the wiki on how to upload and download files from the AOS to the user. That's all great.
I had a session yesterday, and I wrote the extension was to download the info log from batch history to a text file.
So there are ways to do that, but I encourage you to look at the general electronic reporting. There's a lot of features being added in every release. It has features. Essentially, you're abstracting the formatting. You can do Excel, XML, CSV. I think they've added a bunch of stuff since I last looked at it. Delivery
it's a big framework, right?
It's a big framework.
Because it was a huge problem.
Yeah. They have features around delivery mechanisms, automatically emailing it, downloading it, all those types of things. So please look at these technologies. Don't write more code than you really have to, right?
Yeah, and you'll see that customers say, okay, where's the credentials for the database? And similar to our UAT production discussion, they can't have them. But the bring your own database is a great way to get things out of the database that are a little more raw, and they can do what they want with them, or not so raw even.
Yeah, we have plenty of examples of customers that have migrated from 12, essentially re-implemented because their upgrade is about to come out but isn't ready yet. But those customers had like data warehouses on-premise that they've used. Now with the whole cloud story, and they can access SQL directly, how do we get these things out? There's scenarios, it's called BYODB, it's essentially bring your own database, where you can set up these recurring exports of data entities to be specifically to do some of those data warehouse and reporting scenarios that people need.
Yeah.
Specifically around mashups, right? If you
Right.
can't use Power BI because you have some data source on-prem,
Or they've got
there's
some
options.
stored procedure that they've been using
Right.
to run through something. And for UAT and production, for the multi-box environments, you need an Azure SQL database, although the standard tiers are not that expensive. But you can set it up on a dev VM on the local SQL server. So try it out.
You have options, right? Even
Yeah.
though it's cloud, these scenarios have come up and will come up. So if you run into these issues, don't go nuts on finding all these workarounds. You know, reach out to us because you have options, right? We're taking certain privileges away from you accessing things, but we're trying to make sure you can still do what you need to do.
There's
right?
still answers for most of those
Correct.
questions. Right?
And then sys operation, right? It's something that, unfortunately, I think even in our standard application code, we're not uptaking everywhere that we could. But the sys operation framework was introduced in AX 2012. I've always been a big fan of it. It's essentially a replacement for the run base classes. The advantage being that, and especially now in AX 7, you have essentially a web browser, you have a back-end server where all the code runs. You have these sometimes long-running processes, right? You kick something off and you didn't put it in batch, and now it runs forever, and before you know it, your client times out because it thinks the server's no longer. I mean, these things have happened even in our code. We're trying to uptake asynchronous processing, where essentially your stuff can keep running on the server, and then it'll report back once it's done, right? So sys operation has these features. We've actually added them, unfortunately, in a way, to run base as well, to do async. But still, I encourage you to look at the sys operation. On top of that, you get a free web service for whatever your class is doing, right? You can call them through JSON. So think about these scenarios, especially, like I said, the web service you get for free, right? So you write the class, it's a data contract, it's automatically exposed as a web service, as a RESTful JSON web service, which means when we talk about scenarios like Flow and Logic Apps and all this cool stuff on the web, webhooks, all that kind of stuff, Azure functions, whatever you may have, essentially you've exposed your class as a service and you can consume it, right? If you want to trigger a posting or some sort of a job, those things come for free. All right. So, and then writing extensions. So one of the things, and I think, welcome to our world, right? If you're an ISV or a partner that is creating reusable IP, this is essentially what we're running into right now, right? Is how do we, all this code that we have, how do we make sure that the consumers of our code, of your code, can extend yours as well? And we talked about overlayering, and sure, an ISV can ship you the code and you can still overlayer their stuff. But they may just want to be able to ship you their binary only, or they'd rather not have you do the overlayering, or you don't want to do overlayering because that presents challenges in upgrading. You can extend the ISV as well, right? So as a partner, as an ISV, when you're creating reusable IP, think about that as well, right? How do I write my code so that somebody else can extend it? So don't just use extensions. Make your code extensible. And these are some of the things that we're finding as we're digging through these issues we find in our application code. You know, switch statements is a typical issue. You see this a lot in the standard application. You have these, especially construct methods, right? And we'll talk about that in the next session. These construct methods in AX where there's a bunch of enums being checked, and in the end it says default, throw exception, right? That's obviously not extensible. If somebody wants to add something to that, you cannot because you just throw in an exception. Those are things we're trying to be mindful of. We're actually refactoring a lot in our code to make those things extensible. But I encourage everyone in this room as a developer to think about your code as well, right? Large methods, another thing that we're struggling with, and that's kind of the example that was brought up earlier. How do I deal with that? As Microsoft, we have to deal with this. We either put in delegates or we try to split the code into multiple methods, whichever is least intrusive to people in the field. But those are all things we're thinking of. So think of that as well. Try to stick with object-oriented programming in the best sense, right? Use patterns, split things up, be modular in the way you structure things, and sort of automatically your code will be a lot more extensible as well. Plugins, again, we've slowly but surely seeing some uptake in the standard application. For those of you who know the extension framework in 2012, which unfortunately was also called extensions, it's not confusing at all. The idea being that these large construct methods, we're trying to not have those, but essentially make it easier sort of from metadata to run any class in lieu of what you already have, right? So there's documentation on 2012. The same framework still exists in AX7 as well. So think about those extensibility stories. And you may see us do this in our application as well, right? We may have pieces of code that as partners, as customers, you really want to insert code somewhere in the middle, and there's really no good way or no easy way for us to split that code up. We may provide you opportunity to just replace the whole class, right? Before it gets instantiated, you can just give it your own, like implement interfaces, those types of things, right? Those are all good OO principles that, unfortunately, including us at Microsoft in the X++ world, has not been uptaken as much as we would like, which, now that I think about it, interfaces, forms can implement interfaces. That is really cool.
It's super cool.
Queries, that's a big one.
Yeah, and I think it's a sticky wicket, right?
Yes.
But at the end of the day, when the rule, I think is to, when you're not sure about something, encapsulate it, right? So if you're doing insert record sets or those kinds of things, if you have a while loop and it iterates a reasonable number of times, you can put a delegate inside it. If it doesn't, have an insert record set, and then the handler can do the same, do
Right.
another one, or do an update, or work off of the target or the source.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things, but again, it just encapsulate that stuff. that's
Encapsulating, and then the other thing we run into now is people, when we have inline SQL in our code, people want to add stuff to the where clause that's by definition is just not extensible because you're changing the code. And those were just, in our application code, we're taken scenario by scenario. In certain cases, maybe we can replace the inline while select loop with a query run, which by definition is extensible because you can add your own ranges and things like that. It's a sticky point, right? There's certain things that we just cannot do today. There's certain areas where we can't easily change the queries. But again, as you're writing new code, I encourage you to think about these things and try to leverage some of these features like query run. Since we're running in the .NET CLR, things are a lot faster than they used to be with interpreted X++, where if you had object-oriented code with 20 classes and a lot of huge call stacks, X++ with some of the deterministic garbage collection, that stuff could get, pretty nasty as far as performance goes. But those things are gone, right? We're a .NET application, so don't be afraid of creating lots of classes and doing those types of things.
Yeah, if there's that delegate in that while loop, you can add the extra where clause to your handler and just as an if statement if you need to. And
Right.
if you write your own insert or update, then you can put whatever where clause you want.
Right. Okay. Yes, sir.
The specific example you cited, we've been fed with the idea that's a very poor programming practice. Putting an if statement in a while loop because it...
No, in the delegate. In the delegate. In your delegate, you have a specific, because you can't change the where clause.
Right.
At least not if you can't change the where clause, right?
Right. So the point being is some of these things are clearly workarounds for the way some of the original code is written.
Right.
We're saying if you can add a delegate inside of your while select that allows somebody who tries to extend it to potentially manipulate the way your loop works. I agree with you. It's not necessarily a most performant thing to do, but because of the way inline where clauses, you just can't change them through extension, right? So.
Right.
Like I said, we're trying to come up with ways, and we're even looking at, is there something you can do in the language itself? But it's a hard problem, right? And we don't have a good answer for it. We're trying to refactor things as much as we can. Query run is one option, and otherwise putting delegates in. But I agree with you. While select and then an if statement inside of it is not exactly what we've told people was a good thing to do. But there could be scenarios where that's the only way that you could.
Or like I did say that it's a reasonable number of iterations, right?
Right, yeah.
Because you cannot do that don't do that on a general journal account entry, for example.
Right.
It turns out when we go down to performance troubleshooting, one of the first suspects is that statement in the while loop where they're selecting everything practically and then checking for conditions.
Right, yeah. So you're saying, in a lot of code reviews that you've done, you've seen that specifically as performance issue, where people do a broad while select and then filter it down inside of, which is obviously bad, bad performance.
Yeah, the assumption is that somebody is using all those records, maybe just not you.
Yeah. So I agree with you, but
Don't disagree at all.
we're just saying that the query issue is a bit of a stickler at this point, where how we want to deal with that and what we need to do to enable people to extend. Cool. I thought I saw a question there. No? All right, cool. I think that's all we had, actually. I don't know. We're really short.
I think we'll have some questions.
Yeah, so are there questions? And then we can, yes.
I do have a question.
Yeah, we'll go from there.
Talking about the dangerous drag and drop
Yes.
and renaming it. If you just do a right-click new and you add your properties, et cetera, does that avoid that problem with the?
The only danger is the
So
default
let
name.
repeat the question, right? So,
I'm sorry. She's asking about what's in the danger of drag and drop. If you just do a new and add it yourself, does that avoid the danger? And I think the only real danger is the default name, and our suggestion was to rename it.
correct.
If you right-click add new, then you name it then.
You name it then, or
Yeah,
or-
so adding new things with the extensions, I mean, you're adding new things as you go. We're just
Right.
making sure that you change the naming, you use proper naming conventions, right? Set
Right.
these things before you get started, because going through it after the fact, you'll run into what we're saying earlier. If you rename things, other properties will have to get updated manually. So think about it before you start. But you want to rename everything you can, right? New fields, those things.
yeah, use
Yeah, as long as you are consistent and rename it. Yeah.
One more question, and that was, you keep talking about adding delegates, and in 2012, you had the pre and post methods or handlers, and I know on several occasions,
That's-
you said that's not a good idea.
that's not what we're talking about.
Did they do away with that?
No. So as far as events go, right? So as far as events go, the question was, we had some of these things in 2012 already. So just to repeat what we had and what we have now. So in 2012, you could add a pre and a post handler on any method, right? That feature still exists today. The way it's set up is differently, because you essentially declare it in your subscribing code as opposed to putting it on the object itself, because we want to separate these things. The mechanism is slightly different, but the feature works exactly the same, right? So that still exists. When we talk about delegates, we're talking about the fact that you want to add your own event in the middle of some code. In some cases, you can't split up a method into two. Logically, it doesn't make sense. But you may want to provide a way for somebody to do something right in the middle. Easy way to get about that is you add a delegate and then other people can subscribe to it. So that's a delegate feature, which is essentially also still the same as 2012.
and they're very specific.
They're very
Generally,
specific, right, to specific
for a
piece.
specific thing.
With 7, we have a lot of framework-generated events, meaning in the past, for example, if you had a button, I'll get to you next. You don't have to keep your hand up. For example, buttons, you'd have to add, you have to override the clicked method, right? We now actually have an event for that, so that if there's an existing button and you want to execute some code when it gets clicked, you can subscribe to the event. So a lot of the stuff...
I think the slides are going to be
Yeah,
made available.
the slides,
So-
I don't think they're on the thing yet, but they're supposed to be uploaded there. Yeah. So the framework events are there, right? So we have things like, on inserting, on inserted, on tables, updating, deleting, those types of events. Form events, we have an init event. We have
my session from yesterday, I had a click extension and an
Right,
on-click,
yes. So
check
we have a
the
lot of
recording.
framework-based events as well, that when certain things on the form or, so you don't have to override those methods that you've had to do in the past. You can actually use it as an event. Yes. So yeah, question in the back. Okay, so the question was on extending data entities. We advise to essentially use extension features on data entities or create a copy of the entity and do whatever you need with that, right? It's a fair question. In general, I would say you probably want to extend it. However, there may be a good reason, because these entities in general, they're sort of a denormalization of the backend schema, right? And in some cases, messing with that may screw up something else you're trying to do with the data entity. So there are cases where you actually want a separate entity for whatever it is you want to do. So in general, I would say, and I think you have more...
I'm not trying to not answer the question, but if you can do it with an extension,
Yes.
you should, right?
Correct.
And there's quite a bit you can do, including adding data sources to the query and stuff.
Yep.
So if it's adding fields in a data source, a
Yep.
new read-only data source or something, if you
Yeah.
can do it with the extension, you should. A copy should be specific
Right, and
because
I
you have
think,
to, kind of.
I don't know if that's where the question came from, but I know with the initial release last year, we had some issues with data entity extensions. We've added new features in several platform updates. So that at some point there were some cases where the only way you could do it was to duplicate it. But I believe most of those, if not all of those, should be solved.
Or
So
overlayer, or overlayer, right?
Or overlayer,
like
yeah.
the
but-
fields that you added wouldn't show up in Excel, and those have been fixed.
Yeah. So what I encourage you, as Eric said, try to do with extensions, but there may be cases where either you can't or you really want it to be separate. All right. Cool. Other questions?
Right here?
Yes. The timelines of the locking. Yeah, so again, we'll talk about that next, but since we have time anyway. So the intent is, so we'll have a spring release that will come up in a few months. We'll have a fall release, and then this kind of the cadence we'll have spring, fall, right? So this spring release, the intent is that so the application has been split into multiple packages, right? So it's not like one giant application suite. There's things like unit of measure. All that code has been split out on its own, those things. So some of those basic ones, we're already going to soft lock in the spring release so that you'll actually get warnings. When you try to overlayer it, it will give you compiler warnings that you can choose to ignore, but it's sort of a way to make it obsolete going forward, right? So that's what you'll see. Spring release will have some of those smaller packages already soft sealed, meaning you still can, but you'll see compiler warnings. The fall release, which is towards the end of the year, we'll start hard locking those and we'll soft lock the application suite. And then the intent is then the year after that, so 2018, the spring release, is when we're looking to hard lock.
That's a year from now.
But that's a year from now. The other thing to keep in mind, because some people have freaked out, and Shri has been very clear that he wants us to make sure people know this, the application that you're on is supported for 3 years, right, as the current plan. Which means if you take the spring release of this year, you're still doing overlayering, you essentially have 3 years to get rid of that overlayering. Of course, it means you can't upgrade, right? So you have to keep that in mind. But it's not like you'll be stuck and you know, you have to like redo or refactor, you know, in a certain period of time. You have time to do it, but to your point, you want to be cognizant of that time.
But the 3 years is not normal, right? It was done specifically to give the overlaying some
I have
extra
no
life.
idea, to be honest.
Seems like it, right? 3 years is a long,
This is a long
good
time.
amount of time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, and you see that with the platform now, right? I think that we're already seeing a lot of benefits of the platform lock. I think we've done a pretty good job at refactoring things that needed to be done so people could extend it. And that means we can now go onto that model of sort of monthly updates with minimal impact, right? So, yes?
Do you have any experience with the tools for assisting in migrating from overlaying to extension?
So you're
Are there any
asking about
tools?
tools
I think,
for
are there any
migrating
tools?
from what?
From overlayer to extension, are there
From
like
overlaying
tools?
to extend, yeah. We'll talk about it in the next session. We don't.
It's a hard problem.
It's a hard problem, right? We want to tackle that, and there's two areas where we could do that, right? One would be in the code upgrade tool, right? Which today there's a code upgrade tool to migrate code from 12 to 7. We have code upgrades between the major versions. So we had RTW for 7, and then fall release. We'll soon have spring release. the question is, what can we do on the code upgrade side? Are there things we can automatically move over? There are, but they'll probably cause compile errors, which is fine. You can get that with an upgrade. That's one set of tooling that we're considering what can be done automatically. But then there's also the developer tooling, right? If I am going through my code and I have a bunch of lines or a bunch of fields and I want to move them to extensions, today there's obviously a bunch of steps. You can copy, paste, cut, all that kind of stuff. But there we're also looking at, can we automate some of that so that when you're ready, it's a right-click move to extension kind of experience. I mean, it's a hard problem to tackle, especially on the, is that me here? Or?
Maybe.
Oh, okay. It's a hard problem to tackle, especially inside of X++ code. I think on the metadata, it's a bit easier to do because, fields can be moved. The problem there, you run into that domino effect where you move one field out and all the rest of the code breaks, right? So, but so it is in the roadmap in the sense that it's something that we really want to do things, right? And we'll just have to see how. Like I said, it's a hard problem, and if we do things automatically, the question is, do we break more than we fix? Do we cause you more work, or do we reduce the amount of work? So we're looking at it, right? And when and what we'll release, I'm not sure at this point, but it's something we definitely want to tackle. Yes?
Probably makes sense to provide that operator conversion tool to deal with the metadata first before the code, because the code is by far more complicated.
So the comment was, right? It's probably easier to already automatically do the metadata and then figure out the code later. We can, but that then comes back to the question is, are we causing you more work? Are we helping, or are we, So, yeah, it's on our minds for sure. It's a big thing.
The metadata is a more structured problem, right?
Yes.
So,
yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Without guaranteeing anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yesterday you spoke about a case where you would initialize something based on certain conditions that may be different once it's been initialized, and you said it may not be clean, but sort of do the same code afterwards. I'm just wondering where we stand on best practices for maybe dirty code that we
right. So the question is, we did the session yesterday, the one we're going to have after this one, around migrating, right, from overlayering to extension. There were some code examples I showed. One of them was essentially, in a way, an intrusive customization by the definition, in that you put it inside of some other code. And my comment was, instead of avoiding some sort of an if branch that is setting a field, maybe you can just let it do its thing, and then with a handler, just overwrite whatever it just did. I've gotten a lot of comments on that one. And I agree that on the face of it, it's obviously not the greatest solution, right? The point is that I was trying to make anyway, is that there's certain logic flows that you can think about where people say, there's no way I can do this with an extension. And I can typically say, yes, there is. This may not be the best way, and we'll probably want to get your feedback and see, do we need to put in a delegate, or what do we need to do? My point is, it should not hold you back from at least trying to move as much as you can already. So as far as best practices around that, I don't think...
An ugly extension is probably better than a clean overlayer.
Well, yeah, so I didn't want to say that, but essentially, yes.
I said it for you. At least consider it, right?
There are areas where, if that's the last bit of code that you have that's preventing you, then please go with the ugly extension, right? So, but I get the point, and trust me, a lot of people came up to me with that exact example, saying it was just, bad. Okay, I'll admit it was not great, but it is just something I want people to think about. And there's other cases like that, not necessarily overwriting, but at least where you say, my code is additive, right? And I've put it inside of this if statement, but it doesn't matter. I can just do the if again later and add whatever I needed. Not overwriting, but so bad example. I should take it out.
Perf. You shouldn't do
I have what? How much?
No.
See, that's why I needed some extra time for the next session, right, to change the code example. Yes, sir. Yeah, so Yeah, so the question is, if we lock the application suite today, one of the workarounds to deal with protected methods and other things is there's an attribute you can put on methods that says hookable to allow you to do pre and post handlers on existing methods that are protected today, because you can only do it on public. We're actually reviewing that, and we're looking at potentially some language features that we could do to see what we can do with protected methods. So that's something that, because the hookable attribute is in fact an overlayer, so we'd like to avoid it. So it's a scenario it's a requirement that we've put in our backlog on finding out how to solve that one way or another.
Perhaps you can put hookable attribute already in Absolute.
I'm sorry?
Yours, yeah, put hookable in App Suite.
Yeah, today you
That's an
can't, but it'd
option
be
right
an
up.
overlayer today, right? If you put the hookable on. And so that was the question. If we lock it, you can't put the hookable on. What do I do?
We'll just
The
have
other
it.
thing is, in some cases, it's on us to just maybe make some of these methods public or add delegates. And that's kind of the thing that we need your feedback. And again, I'm really digging into the next session already. But we do have feedback mechanisms because we want to hear where exactly you're running to these issues to see if we need to refactor our code, right? We'd love to just go through the whole app suite and fix everything, but that's an impossible task to complete even in multiple years. So we're prioritizing based on feedback. Right. Yeah, so it's just, yeah. It's the same issue, right? So he's saying, sometimes it's not just a hookable, but it's these long methods. They're not very modular. I mean, that's on us, right? To either refactor, provide delegates, but more importantly, take the feedback on where you're seeing this. And you'll see in the next session, we have ways to already find some of those things, and we'll talk about that, how we are approaching that to refactor our code.
Okay.
Not duplicating a class or overriding fields or whatever, not, yeah. I saw somebody there. Yes.
Follow up on that point, and I guess the question is that we're trying to avoid overlay, but in some circumstances we're having to go way out of our way to do so. And Microsoft is saying we may change this to public, we may add a delegate to this method, we may cut this method into multiple parts. But at this point it's almost unavoidable to make either a mess or overlay. You're saying, okay, a bad extension instead of an overlay, but we don't know where you're going with those design decisions on.
Yeah, it's a fair question. So the comment is, we're talking about we may refactor, we may split this up, we may add delegates, and at the same time we're saying, well, and if you can't today, just potentially make a mess, is I think the exact words that you used. And that's a fair comment. And like I said, we're dealing with, I think Peter did a statistic once, it's like 15 or 20 million lines of X++ code or something. I don't know if I'm way out of the league. But anyway, it's in the millions for sure.
There's 80,000 things in App Suite, so
Right, yeah. So
seems about
the
right.
point being is we would love to refactor and clean up a lot of the code, right? You see a lot of code in the application that's bought from third parties. There's a lot of legacy code that even was originally written, I think, outside of X++ and ported over. So we just deal with a lot of these things, and we would love to just go in and refactor the whole thing, but it'd be multiple years worth of work, and your upgrade would be absolutely horrendous, right? So we have to deal with these things piecemeal, and it's really, I agree with you, is you'd love to get an idea of what we're doing. But so 2 points there is, one, we're taking feedback, like actively soliciting feedback on where are the sticky points, what are the things that most people need, tackle those first and just prioritize on what needs to be refactored and where. The other piece is as far as you getting visibility in what we're doing. We are, none of this is set in stone, but we are looking at getting more into sort of a CTP drop, where months in advance we can give you beta bits so you can actually look at the code and see what it is that we're refactoring. We're thinking that's probably a good approach. Definitely also on the ISV side, because obviously when we refactor methods, it could impact a lot of people on the ISV channel, customers, partners, everybody, right? If we split a method in two, that may actually be, kind of a breaking change for a lot of people. So we're figuring that the best way to probably, give you early visibility is get into some better rhythms as far as giving betas out, giving you access to the code that, you know, months in advance so you can get an idea of where we're going.
If I was to submit an example to you today, would you, within a reasonable time frame, be able to suggest which design pattern you will be going through so that I can design my code around in the future?
Yeah, so the question is, if you submit an example to me now, could I tell you whether or not we're changing it or what we're going to do or when we're going to do it? That's a loaded question, right? Because
there is a connect though to like to
well,
vote
but
for
it's
features
he's
and
asking
stuff?
the opposite, right? He's not
Yeah, I
asking,
know.
here's what I need. He's asking, are you going to do something with this, or is it okay if I do my thing?
Which design pattern are you intending to use?
Which design pattern are we intending to use on a specific?
Yeah.
Okay, so. Right, so what are we going to do with this code that you're looking at? I think that is almost an impossible task for us, right? I'd love to say yes to that, but you know, we obviously have too many developers out there that we'd have to answer queries for. And these things move fast internally for us as well, right? We're going through a lot of this refactoring already. We're getting more feedback, so every sprint we decide again what we're going to do next. So essentially every 2 weeks our plans change, if you will, right? So I get the feedback, and we are considered with that, because I think what we're most worried about is not just enabling you, but also who are we breaking, right? We have those two parts we need to keep in mind. So it's a fair question. I think the beta or the CTP drops is probably the more advanced idea that we're working with to give you early visibility.
And if it's a common scenario, right?
Right.
Get those votes for it, and it'll get decided sooner.
Yeah, we're thinking also about some of those, like, can we do more like a public voting system where if like hundreds of people need this one thing fixed, then obviously that's a priority. Again, we're looking, the scale of some of that is a bit of an issue, right? We have to worry about. Yes? Good question. So the question is, can I use a unit testing framework like XUnit? Again, we'll talk about automated testing tomorrow. I think the easy answer is no. The technical details on that is because there's dependencies on the AOS, right? We have done some features where a lot of the unit testing you can actually do inside of Visual Studio on the Test Explorer. So we've enabled a lot of those scenarios. We've actually had to do a lot of magic to make that work. And it's that kind of magic that I believe, and I haven't tried this lately. This has been a long time since I've tried, but I think that that's the sort of thing that XUnit and other unit testing frameworks get stuck on, because there are some runtime things, you know, if you think about extensions, I mean, those are all special X++ things that the kernel, the AOS kernel deals with that, you know, another unit test framework would not have. I'm not aware of any plans to look at that, but it's a good question for tomorrow. I'll have Dave Frosley on stage with me. He's our testing expert, and I think he may have some other more input on that question. Yeah, let's follow up on that. Oh, very good question. Are we planning to support Git? So there's two things, right? That's why I'm kind of hesitant to formulate what I'm about to say. I'm being recorded as well, right? So I have to be careful. Technically, because we're inside of Visual Studio, Visual Studio obviously supports Git, right? So could you use Git today? I have not tried it, but the answer is probably yes. However, the way that we've currently structured LCS to do code upgrades and interact with VSTS is all based on Team Foundation version control. Part of the other issues, and that's something obviously that we could put in a roadmap if we wanted to fix that or make that optional, those types of things. The other thing we were dealing with today is hotfixes. If you're familiar with how Git works, it's essentially based on folders and files, similar to DEV30, but it's a bit more elaborate than that. If you today install a hotfix for the standard application, it essentially replaces the existing code that you have. So if you wanted to do this with a Git backend, you would have to essentially add the whole application suite and source control the whole thing, unless you want to start adding explicit exceptions to hide things from, I mean, so there's some nuances like that. So do we have it in the roadmap? No. Are we planning or thinking of supporting it? I'm not going to say no, but because I think it's a valid question that we've gotten a lot. So it's not in the roadmap, but I would love to see it myself. Yes. Yes. So question is, if we are, and again, we're running into the next session a little bit already as far as these questions, but the question is, if we are sealing, are we still planning to release the source code? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Yes. So we're not going to hide source code. We're just going to avoid you from overlayering or changing it. All right, well, thanks, everyone.